The Prisoner Who Became. The prisoner who became her shelter. Hello, and welcome to Pillow Loom, where we drift into stories that carry us gently toward sleep. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend this quiet time here with me tonight. As you settle into your comfortable space, allow yourself to release the tensions of the day. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Feel your jaw relax, your breathing slow and deepen. Tonight's story will take us to a time of great difficulty, yet within it we'll discover something unexpected. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, human kindness can illuminate the shadows like a candle flame in the night. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose. Hold it gently. And now release it slowly through your mouth, letting go of everything you've been carrying. We're going to travel back to the autumn of 1943, to a small village in the French countryside where the war had cast its long shadow across Europe. But this isn't a story about war. This is a story about shelter, about unexpected protection, about how two souls found each other when the world around them had lost its way. Let your eyes grow heavy as we begin. The village of Sainte-Colombe sat nestled in a gentle valley, surrounded by rolling hills that turned golden brown each autumn. For centuries, its cobblestone streets had echoed with the sounds of daily life. The baker's morning bell, children laughing as they chased each other past the fountain in the village square, the soft clip-clop of horses pulling carts laden with vegetables from the surrounding farms. The stone houses, with their slate roofs and wooden shutters painted in fading blues and greens, had stood for generations, watching over families who had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. But by the autumn of 1943, those sounds had changed. The laughter had grown quieter. The bells rang less often, and new sounds had arrived. The rumble of military vehicles on roads that had once known only farm wagons, the sharp click of boots on stone, voices speaking in a foreign tongue that made the villagers look down at their feet as they passed. In one of the oldest houses on the Rue de l'Église, a young woman named Émilie Mercier lived alone. She was 26 years old, though the war had aged her in ways that mirrors couldn't quite capture. Her husband, Philippe, had been taken 3 years earlier, swept up in one of the early conscriptions. For months she had received letters, each one shorter than the last, until they stopped coming altogether. She didn't know if he was alive or dead, and this not knowing was perhaps the cruelest burden of all. An open wound that couldn't heal, couldn't even properly form a scar. Emily's house was small but sturdy, built of honey-colored stone that glowed warmly in the afternoon sun. It had thick walls, the kind that kept the winter cold at bay and provided blessed coolness during summer's heat. The ground floor held a modest kitchen with a fireplace that had cooked countless meals over the decades, and a small sitting room where a single armchair faced the window overlooking the street. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, though Emily slept in only one now. The other remained as Philippe had left it, as if by preserving his space exactly as it was, she could somehow preserve the possibility of his return. She supported herself as she always had, by taking in mending and alterations. Her stitches were small and even, nearly invisible, a skill her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that. In times of plenty, this work had brought in enough for modest comforts. Now, with fabric scarce and money scarcer, she mended and remended the same garments, patching patches until the original cloth was barely visible beneath the careful repairs. But people still needed their clothes to hold together, and so her work continued, one tiny stitch at a time, holding things together in a world that seemed determined to fall apart. The village had changed in other ways, too. On the outskirts, in what had once been Monsieur Beaumont's dairy farm, the occupying forces had established a small prisoner of war camp. It wasn't large, perhaps 24 men at most, and it wasn't fortified like the larger camps farther east. The prisoners were kept in a converted barn, with a high fence and a handful of guards who rotated in from the regional headquarters. These were Allied soldiers, mostly British and a few Canadians, who had been captured in North Africa or during failed missions in occupied France. They were used for labor, repairing roads damaged by military vehicles, harvesting what remained of the crops in fields where young men once worked but no longer returned, loading and unloading supplies at the railway station 2 villages over. Emily had seen them sometimes, marching in a ragged line through the village on their way to work details. They wore uniforms that had once been proper military issue but were now faded and patched, much like the clothes she mended. Some walked with heads down, shoulders hunched against the weight of captivity. Others still tried to maintain a military bearing, backs straight, eyes forward, as if defiance could be found in posture alone. The guards shouted at them in German, words that cracked through the morning air like whips, though the actual whips were rarely used. At least not here. Not in this small backwater camp, where the war felt more like a heavy blanket smothering everything, rather than the sharp blade it was elsewhere. The villagers were forbidden from speaking to the prisoners, from offering them food or water or any kindness. To do so meant punishment, though what form that punishment might take was left deliberately vague, perhaps because the uncertainty was itself a form of control. Fear of the unknown kept people in line better than any specific threat. But humans are curious creatures, and even in fear we cannot help but look. And so, Emily had noticed one prisoner in particular. He was tall, taller than most of the others, with broad shoulders that spoke of a life that had once included enough food and physical work done by choice rather than compulsion. His hair was dark, turning to silver at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than 35. What struck her most, though she tried not to look too closely, tried not to single out any particular prisoner lest someone notice her noticing, was his face. It was weathered, lined with exhaustion, and something else. Not defeat exactly, but a deep weariness. The look of someone who had seen too much and was trying to preserve some small core of himself against it all. She had seen him 3 or 4 times over the months, always in passing. Once, when the work detail passed her house, he had stumbled slightly on the uneven cobblestones, and she had taken half a step toward him before catching herself. Their eyes had met for just a moment. His were blue, she had noticed, the color of winter sky. And then he had straightened himself and moved on, and she had stepped back into her doorway, heart pounding at her own foolishness. His name was Thomas, though she didn't know this yet. Thomas Ashford, formerly Flight Lieutenant Thomas Ashford of the Royal Air Force, though that title seemed to belong to another life, another person, someone who had existed before his plane was shot down over occupied France, before the capture, before the transport to various camps, before he ended up here in this small village whose name he couldn't even pronounce correctly. Thomas had been in captivity for nearly 2 years. The first 6 months had been the hardest, the shock of it, the transition from being a man with agency and purpose to being a number, a body to be moved from place to place at the whim of others. He had been held at a larger camp initially, where the conditions had been worse, the guards harsher, the thin soup and black bread barely enough to sustain life. Men had died there, not from bullets or violence, but simply from the slow grinding down of body and spirit until there was nothing left to keep going. But Thomas had kept going. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He had no grand philosophy about survival, no burning desire to return home, home being a cold little flat in London where his mother had lived before the bombing took her, where his father had already been gone for years before the war even started. He had no sweetheart waiting for him, no children bearing his name. He kept going, perhaps simply because stopping required a decision, and he had learned that in captivity, the safest thing to do was to not decide anything, to simply exist from one moment to the next, to not think too far ahead, lest the despair of all those empty future moments crush him entirely. When he had been transferred to this smaller camp, it had felt almost like a reprieve. The guards here were neither kind nor particularly cruel. They simply were, doing their duty with a sort of weary indifference that mirrored his own. The work was hard, but not impossible. The food was still inadequate, but no worse than before. And the village itself, with its quiet streets and old stone buildings, had a sort of peaceful quality that felt surreal against the backdrop of everything else. Sometimes, marching through its narrow lanes, he could almost imagine what it must have been like before the war, could almost hear the echoes of the life that had once flourished here. And sometimes, passing a particular house with green shutters and pots of herbs growing in the window despite everything, he would see her, a woman with dark hair pulled back from her face, eyes that seemed to carry their own weight of sorrow. He never looked directly at her. That would draw attention, would perhaps put her at risk for nothing more than being looked at. But in his peripheral vision, in those brief moments, he was aware of her presence the way you might be aware of a warm patch of sunlight in a cold room, and he would find himself breathing a little deeper, standing a little straighter, as if her mere existence reminded him that he, too, still existed as more than just a prisoner, more than just a number. Autumn deepened, and the days grew shorter. The leaves on the few trees that lined the village streets turned yellow and brown, then fell, carpeting the cobblestones with a brittle covering that whispered underfoot. The air took on that particular quality of approaching winter, sharp and clear, that made everything feel more vivid, and at the same time more fragile, as if the cold might shatter it all. And then came the night that changed everything. It was late October, and the evening had settled in early, as autumn evenings do. The sky had been overcast all day, a heavy gray ceiling that pressed down on the world and made everything feel closed in. Emily had spent the afternoon mending a coat that belonged to the baker's wife, her needle moving in and out of the thick wool with practiced efficiency. She worked by the window to catch the last of the daylight, and when that faded, she had lit her single precious candle and continued working, because idle hands gave the mind too much time to wander into dangerous territories, memories, worries, the vast empty space where the future should have been. It was perhaps 9 o'clock when she heard the first sounds. At first, she thought it was thunder, that heavy, rolling rumble that makes the air itself seem to vibrate. But thunder doesn't come with accompanying flashes of light, at least not the kind of mechanical, orange-tinged flashes that were now visible through her window. Bombing. Not here, not directly over the village, but close enough. Perhaps the rail yard that lay a few kilometers to the east, or the bridge over the river. The Allies were pushing harder now. Everyone knew it, even if speaking of such things was dangerous. The bombing raids had become more frequent, more daring, striking at supply lines and infrastructure deep in occupied territory. Emily set down her sewing and went to the window. She shouldn't be standing here, silhouetted against her candle. She should blow it out, should go to the small cellar beneath her kitchen where she kept her preserved vegetables, where the walls were thick and the single high window was at ground level. She had been told to do this, had been instructed with the rest of the village about air raid procedures. But she found herself frozen at the window, watching the orange glow pulse against the clouds to the east, listening to the thunder that wasn't thunder. And then she heard something else. Voices in the street, sharp and urgent, speaking German. Boots on cobblestones, running. She pulled back from the window, her heart beginning to hammer in her chest. Through a gap in her shutters, she could see figures moving in the street below. Guards from the camp, she realized. Perhaps a dozen of them. Some carrying rifles, others just running, all moving in the direction of the bombs. Something had happened. An escape attempt, perhaps, timed to coincide with the raid when attention would be divided, when the chaos might provide cover. This was not her concern, she told herself. She should blow out her candle, go to the cellar, and wait for morning. Whatever was happening out there was not her business, could not be her business. Getting involved would be worse than foolish. It would be suicidal. But even as she thought this, even as she began to turn away from the window, a movement caught her eye. A figure, running low and fast, had appeared at the far end of the street. Even in the darkness, she recognized something in the way he moved. That particular height, those broad shoulders. The prisoner she had noticed before. The one with the sad eyes. He was alone, separated from any others who might have also tried to escape. He was moving quickly but without apparent direction, like a man who knew he needed to run but had no idea where to run to. Behind him, perhaps a street away, she could hear shouting, the sounds of pursuit. "This is not your concern," a voice in her head said firmly. "Let him run. Let him be caught. Let him be someone else's problem." But her body betrayed her mind. She found herself at her door, found her hand on the latch. The street was empty for this brief moment. The guards had passed, chasing after other escapees or drawn by the bombing. He was perhaps 20 meters away, and he had seen her door open. Their eyes met, and in that instant, she saw something that made her decision before her conscious mind could catch up with it. She saw a human being, terrified and desperate. She stepped back and opened the door wider. She didn't say anything. Words would carry in the night, would draw attention. She simply opened the door and looked at him, and he understood. He changed direction, crossed the street in 3 long strides, and slipped through her door. She closed it behind him, her hands shaking now, the full weight of what she had just done beginning to settle over her. They stood in her small entryway, both breathing hard, though her exertion was merely adrenaline, while his was the result of running for his life. In the dim light from her kitchen, where the candle still burned, she could see him more clearly than she ever had before. His face was streaked with dirt, his uniform torn at one shoulder. There was a cut above his left eye, fresh blood trickling down into his eyebrow. But it was his eyes that held her, those winter sky blue eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and something else, something that might have been apology. Je suis désolé, he said in heavily accented French. I am sorry. The words were quiet, urgent. I did not mean, I will go, Taisez-vous, she whispered sharply. Be quiet, because she could hear them now. Hear the boots approaching, hear voices calling to each other in German. The search had spread to this street. She looked around her small house with new eyes, trying to see it as a hiding place, rather than simply as home. The cellar? No, that would be the first place they'd look. Under the bed? Too obvious, and besides, he wouldn't fit. He was too tall. The wardrobe? Same problem. Where could you hide a man in a house this small? A house that could be searched in less than 5 minutes. And then her eyes fell on the fireplace. It was old, that fireplace. Built perhaps 200 years ago when the house had first been constructed. It was large, designed for cooking as well as heating, and, like many old fireplaces, it had a deep recess where the fire burned. But more than that, and this was something she remembered suddenly from childhood. From exploring this house when she and Philippe had first moved in, it had a small alcove to one side of the main fireplace, a space that had once been used for storing wood, or for a person to sit close to the fire during the coldest nights. Over the years, someone had partially bricked it up, reducing the opening, but the space behind was still there. Come, she whispered, grabbing his arm. She was shocked by how thin it felt beneath the fabric of his uniform, how much he had wasted away. She pulled him toward the kitchen, toward the fireplace. The fire had died down to embers. She never kept it burning high at night. Couldn't afford to waste the wood. She showed him the alcove, the narrow opening. In there. Now. He looked at the space, then at her, uncertainty clear on his face. If they find me here, they will punish you. If we stand here arguing, they will find us both. Get in. He got in. It was a tight fit, and he had to curl himself into a position that looked profoundly uncomfortable. But the opening was narrow enough, and the shadows deep enough, that if you didn't know to look, you might not see him. She quickly grabbed a few pieces of wood from her store and stacked them in front of the opening, then threw her mending over them. The baker's wife's coat, a tablecloth she had been repairing, a handful of other items that made it look as though this was simply where she kept things waiting to be worked on. The knock on her door came before she had time to do more. It was not a polite knock. It was the kind of knock that was really a statement. Open this door now, or we will open it for you. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she took a breath, smoothed her skirt, and went to the door. She opened it to find 2 soldiers, both young, neither of whom she recognized. One was holding a flashlight, the beam sweeping across her face, making her squint. Madame, the one with the flashlight said in passable French, there has been an escape from the camp. We are searching all buildings. You will allow us to enter. It wasn't a question. She stepped aside, and they came in, their boots loud on her floor, their presence filling her small house in a way that felt violating. They moved quickly but thoroughly, one heading immediately up the narrow stairs to the bedrooms, the other beginning to look around the ground floor. She stood by the door, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking, trying to look like a woman annoyed at being disturbed, but not afraid. Certainly, not terrified. The soldier upstairs was opening doors, his heavy footsteps moving from room to room. The one downstairs was now in her kitchen, and her breath caught as he approached the fireplace. He shone his light around, illuminating the herbs hanging to dry from the beam, the small table where she ate her solitary meals, the stack of wood beside the fireplace. He looked at the alcove. His light played across the wood stacked there, across the fabric she had so hastily thrown over it. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, he stood there, and she was certain he would pull the wood aside, would discover what lay behind it, and then— But he didn't. Perhaps he saw exactly what she had meant him to see: a woman's workspace, a cluttered corner where mending waited. Perhaps he was in a hurry, eager to move on to the next house. Perhaps he simply didn't care enough to be thorough. He turned away, sweeping his light around the rest of the room one more time, before heading back toward the door. The soldier upstairs came down, shaking his head to indicate he had found nothing. They conferred briefly in German. Then the one who spoke French turned back to her. "You have seen no one? Heard nothing unusual tonight?" She shook her head. "Only the noise from the east. The bombs. Is that why? If you see anything, any of the prisoners, you will report it immediately. Harboring a prisoner is a serious crime, madame. You understand this?" "Of course," she said, managing to keep her voice steady. They left, not bothering to close the door behind them. She waited until she heard their boots recede down the street, waited until she heard them knocking on another door, and then she closed her own door carefully and stood there for a moment, her legs suddenly weak. She went to the kitchen, to the fireplace, and began pulling away the wood, the fabric. "They're gone," she'd whispered. "You can—" He emerged slowly, unfolding himself from the cramped space. He stood there in her kitchen, a man who by rights shouldn't exist, shouldn't be here, and she looked at him and realized that she had just crossed a line from which there was no return. She had saved him, yes, but she had also bound herself to him. His fate and hers were now entangled, whether either of them had wanted it or not. "Thank you," he said quietly in his accented French. "I know that what you did, the risk—" "We need to think," she interrupted, "because gratitude, while perhaps deserved, wouldn't solve the very practical problem they now faced. They will come back. Tomorrow, perhaps the next day, they will search again. You cannot stay in that hiding spot. It was adequate for tonight, but—" She trailed off, looking around her house as if the walls themselves might offer solutions. "I should go," he said. "Now, before morning. I can try to reach the countryside. Find—" "Find what?" she asked, not unkindly. "You're in a prison uniform. You have no papers, no food, no idea where you are or where to go. How far do you think you would get?" He had no answer to that, because they both knew the truth. He would be captured again within a day, perhaps less. And this time, the punishment would be severe. For him, certainly, but also for her, because they would question him about where he had hidden during the night, and what could he tell them but the truth? "You need to stay here," she heard herself say, the words coming out before she had fully thought them through. "At least for a few days, until the search dies down, until they assume you've been caught or have fled far from here. I cannot ask you to do that. The risk? You're not asking. I'm telling you. This is my house and my decision." She said it firmly, with more confidence than she felt, because even as the words left her mouth, she was aware of how insane this was. She was going to hide a prisoner of war in her house, not for a few hours, not for a single night, but for days, perhaps longer. This was not a small act of mercy that could be rationalized away. This was treason, collaboration with the enemy, however you wanted to frame it. But she had already made the choice. The moment she opened her door to him, she had made the choice. "What is your name?" she asked. "Thomas," he said after a moment. "Thomas Ashford." "Emily," she replied. "Emily Mercier." And with that exchange of names, with that simple act of introduction, they ceased to be prisoner and villager, enemy and occupied civilian. They became simply two people trying to survive. The first few days were the hardest. The search continued, though less intensively each day. Several escapees were caught within the first 24 hours, hunted down in fields or found hiding in barns. One was shot trying to cross a checkpoint. The village held its collective breath, keeping its head down, trying to appear as normal as possible, while soldiers moved through streets and knocked on doors. Emily continued her routines as best she could. She sat by her window and mended clothes. She went to the baker's shop every other day for her small ration of bread. She fetched water from the village pump. She spoke to her neighbors in the careful, neutral way that had become habitual, acknowledging them without really communicating anything, maintaining the pleasant fiction that everything was normal, that this was simply how life was now and would always be. But inside her house, nothing was normal. Thomas couldn't stay in the fireplace alcove indefinitely. It was too small, too uncomfortable, and besides, she needed to cook, which meant she needed to use the fireplace. So they had worked together to create a better hiding space. In the second bedroom, the one that had been Philippe's study before he was taken, there was a large armoire, a massive piece of furniture that had belonged to her grandfather. It was the kind of sturdy, well-made piece that would last generations, with shelves inside for clothing and a deep bottom drawer for larger items. But what made it useful for their purposes was that the back panel, like many pieces of old furniture, was not quite flush with the wall. There was a gap, perhaps 40 centimeters deep, between the back of the armoire and the wall itself. Not much, but enough for a person to squeeze into if they didn't mind standing very still for extended periods. They had moved the armoire slightly, pulled it just far enough away from the wall to allow access to this space while still making it look like the furniture was simply positioned as it always had been. Thomas could slip behind it if needed, and she could quickly push it back against the wall, and unless someone actually moved the heavy piece of furniture themselves, they wouldn't know anyone was there. It wasn't a permanent solution. Nothing about this situation was permanent or even particularly sustainable. But it was better than nothing, and in these times, better than nothing sometimes had to be good enough. During the day, Thomas stayed mostly in the upstairs rooms, away from windows. Emily had given him Philippe's clothes to wear. They fit well enough, though they were loose on his frame. The prison uniform was hidden in the bottom of a trunk, under layers of old linens. If anyone were to see him from a distance, through a window, he might pass for a villager, though they couldn't risk him being seen at all if it could be avoided. The nights were easier in some ways. After curfew, when the streets were empty and the only sounds were the occasional patrol passing through, Thomas could move more freely in the house. He could sit by the small fire and warm himself. He could stand at the window and look out at the village. at the world he had been cut off from. They were careful with light, careful with sounds. They spoke in whispers, even when whispering wasn't strictly necessary, as if their voices might somehow carry through the thick stone walls and betray them. They rationed the candles, the firewood, even the water, because any deviation from her normal usage might be noticed, might raise questions, and slowly, carefully, they began to learn about each other. Emily told him about Philippe, about their quiet life together before the war, about how they had planned to have children someday, about how she didn't know if he was alive or dead, and which uncertainty was worse. She told him about her parents, gone for years now, about how this house held generations of memories, and she couldn't bear to leave it, even when the war came and other families fled to the countryside. She told him about the village as it had been, describing the market days and festivals, the weddings and christenings, trying to paint a picture of life when life had been worth living, for reasons beyond simple survival. Thomas told her about London, about growing up in a city that seemed impossibly large and impossibly crowded compared to this quiet village. He told her about joining the RAF, about the thrill of flying, about how being in the air had felt like the only time he truly understood what freedom meant. He told her about his crew, about the men he had flown with, about the night they were shot down, and how he was the only one who survived the crash. He carried that weight, that survivor's guilt, and speaking of it to her in the quiet darkness of her kitchen was the first time he had put it into words. They were, in many ways, an unlikely pair. Different languages, different countries, different worlds. Under normal circumstances, they never would have met, never would have had reason to speak to each other. But these were not normal circumstances, and in the forced intimacy of hiding, in the shared danger that bound them together, something grew between them that neither had expected and neither quite knew what to do with. It wasn't love, not yet. That word seemed too bold, too presumptuous for the strange relationship they had formed. But it was a connection, recognition, the sense of seeing and being seen that human beings crave, and that war tries so hard to extinguish. In caring for him, in providing him shelter, Emily found a purpose beyond mere survival. In accepting her help, in trusting her with his life, Thomas found a reason to believe that not everything in the world had been corrupted by this war. The days became a week, then 2 weeks. The search for escaped prisoners eventually wound down. Life in the village returned to its new, diminished normal. The guards at the camp became less vigilant, settling back into their routines now that the excitement was over, and most of the escapees had been accounted for. Thomas was not among those accounted for, which meant he was assumed to either be dead or far away, both acceptable outcomes from the guard's perspective. But Thomas was neither dead nor far away. He was in a small house on the Rue de l'Église, living a strange half-life, suspended between captivity and freedom, between prisoner and person. Emily's routine expanded to accommodate him. She found ways to acquire slightly more food, not so much that it would be noticed, but enough to feed 2 people instead of 1. She traded her mending services for extra vegetables from the woman who kept a garden. She bought slightly more bread than her ration technically allowed, trusting that the baker, who had known her all her life, wouldn't question it too closely. Every additional bite of food was a calculated risk, but hunger was also a risk, and they had to balance one against the other. The autumn deepened toward winter. The days grew shorter and colder. The first frost came, silvering the rooftops and turning the cobblestones treacherous in the early morning. Emily used more firewood to keep the house warm, and this was both necessary and dangerous. Too much smoke from her chimney might attract attention, might make someone wonder why a woman living alone needed so much heat. But somehow they managed. They were careful, so careful. And careful was what kept them alive and undiscovered. They developed systems, routines, ways of existing together in this small space that minimized risk while maximizing the fragile comfort they could offer each other. On one particularly cold November evening, after Emily had finished her daily mending and had prepared a thin vegetable soup for their supper, they sat together by the fireplace. Thomas was wearing one of Philippe's sweaters, and Emily had wrapped herself in a shawl that had belonged to her mother. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind rattled the shutters. "Tell me something," Thomas said, his French improving with practice, though still flavored with his English accent. "Tell me something good about this place, about your life here before the war. I want to remember that this village was once more than what it is now." Emily thought for a moment, letting her mind drift back to memories that felt both painfully close and impossibly distant. "There was a festival," she said finally, "every August. The Fête de la Moisson, the Harvest Festival. The farmers would bring their best produce, and there would be music in the square and dancing. Philippe and we met at that festival. I was 17 and he was 20, and he asked me to dance, and I said no the first time because I was shy. But he asked again, and I said yes, and we danced until my feet hurt, and the stars were out, and my mother was calling for me to come home." She smiled at the memory, though the smile was tinged with sadness. "We were married the next summer, at that same festival. The whole village came. There was so much food, so much wine, so much laughter. I wore a dress that had been my grandmother's, and it smelled of lavender from the sachets in the wardrobe where it had been kept. And when we danced, when Philippe held me in the middle of the square with everyone watching, I thought this was what life was supposed to be. This joy, this community, this sense of belonging to something larger than yourself." Thomas listened, and in the firelight she could see that his eyes had grown distant, perhaps seeing his own memories layered over hers. "My mother used to take me to Hyde Park," he said. "On Sundays, after church, we would feed the ducks, and she would buy me an ice cream, and we would sit on a bench and watch people go by. Couples holding hands, children playing, dogs chasing balls, ordinary things, but they felt magical somehow. The way ordinary things can be when you're young and the world hasn't yet shown you how cruel it can be." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own remembering, and then Thomas said quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" Emily asked. "For reminding me that good things existed, that they might exist again, somewhere, sometime. When you've been a prisoner for so long, you start to forget. You start to believe that this," he gestured vaguely, encompassing not just the house but everything, the whole diminished world they inhabited, that this is all there is, all there ever was. "Good things can still exist," Emily said, though she wasn't sure she fully believed it. "Even now, even here. Maybe not festivals or dancing, but this." She gestured between them, at the fire, at the soup they were sharing, at the simple fact of human connection in the midst of inhumanity. "This is good, isn't it?" Thomas met her eyes, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch. It was gratitude, yes, but it was more than that. It was recognition, connection, the acknowledgement of what they had become to each other in these weeks of shared danger and shared survival. "Yes," he said, "this is good." And Emily realized in that moment that she had found something she had thought was lost forever. Not happiness, that seemed too large a word for the small, fragile thing that existed between them, but purpose, perhaps, hope. The sense that even in the darkest times, even when the world seems to have given up on humanity, individual humans can still choose to be human, to see each other, to care. She had saved him from capture that night, had given him shelter, but he had given her something too, a reason to keep going, to believe that her life still mattered, that her choices still had meaning. Winter settled over the village like a blanket of snow, beautiful and cold and isolating. The shorter days meant less work could be done by daylight, which meant fewer people on the streets, which meant in some ways more safety for Thomas, but also more risk. Any deviation from normal patterns was more noticeable when there was less activity overall. The cold was its own challenge. Emily's house, sturdy as it was, had not been built with perfect insulation. The thick stone walls helped, but heat escaped through gaps around the windows, through the chimney, through 1,000 small spaces that had never seemed important before but now represented precious warmth being lost. They kept the fire going as much as they dared, huddled close to it, wearing layers of clothing that made them look bulkier than they were. Food became scarcer. The village's supplies, never abundant, dwindled as winter deepened. The rationing became stricter, the portions smaller. Emily found herself hungry most of the time, a gnawing emptiness that she tried to ignore. She made sure Thomas ate more than she did. He needed it more, she reasoned. He had been starved for so long in the camp. But this meant she grew thinner, her clothes hanging looser, her face becoming more angular. Thomas noticed, of course. He protested, tried to refuse food, tried to insist they share equally. But Emily was stubborn, and in her own house she held a kind of authority that he couldn't quite argue with. So he ate what she gave him, and tried not to think too hard about what it was costing her. December arrived, and with it came the question that neither of them had wanted to address directly. What happened next? How long could this continue? Thomas couldn't stay hidden in this house forever. Eventually, something would change. The war would end, one way or another, or they would be discovered, or some other external force would intervene and make decisions for them. But talking about the future felt dangerous, like tempting fate. So instead, they focused on the present, on each day as it came, on the small rituals that gave structure to their strange existence. Every morning, Emily would wake early before the sun rose. She would light a small fire, just enough to take the chill off the kitchen, and she would begin her day as she always had, checking what food they had, planning meals that could be stretched further, organizing her mending work. Thomas would wake later, moving carefully through the house in the dim light, always listening for any sounds from outside that might signal danger. During the day, while Emily sat by her window and sewed, Thomas stayed upstairs, reading when there was enough light. Emily had given him Philippe's small collection of books, volumes of poetry and philosophy and history that had been gathering dust. When it grew too dark to read, he would simply sit, thinking, remembering, trying to keep his mind active, and his spirits from falling too far. Evenings were theirs. Once the sun set and the curfew took effect, once the streets were empty and the risk of unexpected visitors diminished, they would come together in the kitchen. Thomas would help Emily prepare their modest dinner, though his cooking skills were limited. In his previous life he had never needed to learn, had taken for granted that food would simply appear when he was hungry. Now he learned from Emily how to make do with almost nothing, how to turn a few vegetables and some stale bread into something resembling a meal. They would eat slowly, making it last, talking about anything and everything. Their conversations ranged from the deeply personal to the abstractly philosophical, from memories of their past lives to speculations about what might come after. Thomas told her about flying, about what it felt like to be above the clouds, to see the earth spread out below like a map, made real. Emily told him about her craft, about how there was a kind of meditation in the repetitive motion of needle through fabric, in the slow transformation of something broken into something whole. They told each other stories, some true and some embellished, some completely invented, fairy tales from their childhoods, ghost stories that made them laugh nervously, imaginative futures where the war was over and they were free. These invented stories were perhaps the most precious, because they required both of them to believe, at least for the duration of the telling, that there could be a future worth imagining. On Christmas Eve, Emily did something that surprised even herself. She had saved, carefully and secretly, a small amount of flour, a precious egg, a bit of sugar that she had traded half her own bread ration for. And with these ingredients, in the middle of a war, in a house where a fugitive was hiding, she made a small cake. It wasn't much, barely larger than her palm, and not particularly well risen, given the age of the flour and the weakness of the egg. But she baked it in the embers of the evening fire, and when it was done, she dusted it with the tiniest amount of sugar, and she presented it to Thomas with a shy pride that made her feel like a girl again. "Joyeux Noël," she said quietly. "Merry Christmas." Thomas looked at the cake, at her, at the cake again, and then, to her surprise, his eyes filled with tears. He blinked them back quickly, clearing his throat, but she had seen them. "I didn't think," he started, then stopped. "I didn't think I would celebrate Christmas again. Not like this. Not with—" He gestured at the cake, at the house, at her, unable to find words adequate to what he was feeling. They shared the cake, breaking it into pieces with their fingers, savoring each small bite. It was dry and not very sweet, but in that moment it tasted better than any elaborate dessert from before the war, because it represented something more than just food. It represented defiance, hope, the stubborn insistence that even in the darkest times, humans could still create moments of light. After they finished the cake, Emily did something else she hadn't planned. She reached out and took Thomas's hand. It was the first time they had touched deliberately, beyond the accidental brushes that occurred when moving around the small house. His hand was rough, calloused from years of military work and then prison labor, but it was warm, and it closed gently around hers. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, watching the fire burn down to embers. Neither spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. In that silence, in that simple touch, was everything, gratitude and affection, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. The winter months that followed were hard in ways that had nothing to do with cold or hunger. They were hard because Thomas and Emily were falling in love. And love in wartime is perhaps the most dangerous thing of all. It makes you vulnerable. It makes you care about the future. It makes you have something to lose. They tried to fight it, or at least to not acknowledge it too openly. Emily reminded herself that Thomas was here because he had no choice, that gratitude could be mistaken for deeper feelings, and that when the war ended, if the war ended, he would return to England, and she would remain here, and whatever this was between them would fade like a dream on waking. Thomas told himself that he was putting her in danger just by existing in her house, that any feelings he had for her were selfish, that he had no right to complicate her life further with emotions that couldn't lead anywhere, that could only make the inevitable separation harder. But the heart doesn't listen to logic, and feelings don't respect wartime pragmatism. And so, despite their best efforts at denial, despite all the rational arguments they made to themselves in the dark hours before dawn, they fell in love. It happened in small moments. The way she would mend a torn seam in his borrowed shirt with the same care she gave to the garments she worked on for pay. The way he would save the best portion of their meager dinner for her, slipping it onto her plate when he thought she wasn't looking. The way they had learned to communicate in glances and subtle gestures, a private language born of necessity, but becoming something more. It happened in larger moments, too. The evening when Emily had a fever, nothing serious but enough to make her weak and dizzy, and Thomas had insisted she rest while he took over her mending work, his large hands fumbling with the needle, but determined to help. The night when Thomas woke from a nightmare, crying out in his sleep, and Emily had come running, had sat with him until his breathing calmed, her hand on his shoulder, her presence anchoring him back to the present. They didn't speak of it directly. To speak of it would make it real, would force them to confront all the impossible complications it created. But it was there, in the space between them, growing stronger with each passing day, until it became impossible to pretend otherwise. January became February, and February brought news that filtered into the village through whispered conversations and forbidden radio broadcasts. The Allies were advancing, slowly, painfully, at great cost, but advancing nonetheless. The tide of the war was turning. It was not yet clear how or when it would end, but for the first time in years, it was possible to believe that it might end, that this state of existence might not be permanent. This news brought hope, but it also brought fear. As the Allies advanced, the occupation forces became more unpredictable, more desperate. There were rumors of increased searches, of harsher punishments for even minor infractions. The village held its breath, trying to be invisible, trying not to attract any attention that might bring trouble down on their heads. For Emily and Thomas, this meant being even more careful than before. They spoke in whispers, even during the day. Thomas moved as little as possible, staying in the upstairs rooms, away from windows. They rationed their supplies even more strictly, knowing that any unusual purchases might raise suspicion now that everyone was on edge. It was during this time, in the gray light of a February morning, that something happened that changed everything. Emily had gone to the baker's for her bread ration, as she did every other day. It was a simple errand, one she had done hundreds of times, and she thought nothing of it. But when she returned to her house, bread wrapped in her basket, she found her front door slightly ajar. She stopped on the street, her heart suddenly pounding. She knew she had closed that door. She always closed it carefully, always made sure it was latched. It wasn't the kind of thing you forgot, not when forgetting could mean disaster. For a moment, she considered turning around, walking away, finding somewhere else to be. But Thomas was inside. If someone had discovered him, if the house was being searched, she needed to know. She needed to face whatever was coming. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was quiet. Nothing seemed disturbed in the entryway in the small sitting room. She moved toward the kitchen, each step feeling like it took an eternity. And there, standing by her fireplace, she found someone she recognized but had never expected to see in her house. It was Gabriel, the boy who helped run errands for several families in the village, who was perhaps 14 years old, and whose mother cleaned houses for those who could still afford such help. He was standing very still, his eyes wide, and in front of him, also very still, was Thomas. The three of them stood frozen in a tableau of mutual shock. Emily's mind raced, trying to calculate, trying to find a way to explain this, to salvage the situation. But what explanation could possibly suffice? Gabriel had seen Thomas. There was no talking their way out of this. It was Gabriel who spoke first, his voice shaking. "I came to deliver some eggs my mother had extra. The door was open. I didn't know. I thought—" "Gabriel?" Emily said, as calmly as she could manage, though her voice betrayed her fear. "You cannot tell anyone what you've seen here. Please, I'm begging you." The boy looked between Thomas and Emily, confusion and fear warring on his young face. "But he's one of them, the prisoners. They said they were all caught or escaped far away. If they find out he's here, if they find out you've been hiding him—" "I know what will happen," Emily interrupted. "I know the risks. But Gabriel, please, look at him. He's just a man. He's done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong country at the wrong time. And She swallowed hard, making a decision to trust this boy with the truth. Because what choice did she have? I couldn't let him die. I couldn't let him be captured. Could you? Gabriel looked at Tomas again, really looked at him, and perhaps he saw what Emily saw. Not an enemy, not a prisoner, but a human being, tired and frightened and trying to survive. Gabriel was young, but he had lived through 4 years of occupation. He had seen what cruelty looked like, had learned to recognize the difference between rules that protected people and rules that simply asserted power. "My cousin was taken," Gabriel said slowly, 2 years ago, taken for forced labor in Germany. We don't know if he's alive. We don't know if we'll ever see him again." He paused, his eyes still on Thomas. Someone somewhere might be helping him. Someone might be keeping him safe. I would want to believe that. I would want to believe that not everyone in the world is cruel. Emily held her breath, waiting. "I won't tell," Gabrielle said finally. "I won't tell anyone he's here. But, Madame Mercier, you need to be more careful, much more careful. There are people in this village who would turn you in without hesitation, for reward or favor, or just because they're afraid not to. You need to be so careful." The relief that flooded through Emily was almost overwhelming. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Gabriel." The boy nodded, then turned to Thomas. "If you need anything, if she needs anything, you can trust me. I can help bring food, run errands, things that won't look suspicious. My mother and I, we go everywhere in the village. No one thinks twice about us." And so their small conspiracy of 2 became 3. Gabriel proved true to his word. never speaking of what he had discovered, but quietly helping in ways that made their survival easier. He would bring extra vegetables when his mother's garden had surplus, would pass along information about increased patrols or searches, would serve as an early warning system when danger might be approaching. His help was invaluable, but it also added another layer of risk, another person who could be punished if their secret was discovered. Emily lay awake many nights, worrying not just about Thomas and herself, but about Gabriel, about this boy who had chosen to help them when he could have chosen safety instead. March arrived, bringing the first hints of spring. The snow melted, turning the streets into rivers of mud. Buds appeared on the few trees that lined the village roads. The days grew longer, light lingering later into the evening. And with the changing season came more news. The Allies were closer. The liberation of France was becoming not just a distant hope, but a real possibility. But possibility is not certainty, and the wait was agonizing. Every day that Thomas remained hidden was another day they might be discovered. Every night was another night they might not wake up free. The strain of it wore on them both, though they tried to hide it from each other, tried to remain strong for each other's sake. It was during this time that Emily finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. The question she had been afraid to voice because of what the answer might mean. They were sitting by the fireplace, as they did every evening. Thomas had been reading aloud from one of Philippe's books, a collection of poetry that neither of them particularly understood, but that filled the silence with something other than their own worried thoughts. He had just finished a poem about spring and renewal, and the last words hung in the air between them. "Thomas," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when this is over, when the war ends, and you're free to go, what will you do?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "I suppose I'll return to England. That's where I'm from, where I was from. I don't know what will be there for me. My mother is gone. I have no other family, no home to return to, not really. But I suppose that's where I'll go, because where else would I go?" Emily nodded, her throat tight. It was the answer she had expected, the logical answer, the only answer that made sense. And yet, hearing it spoken aloud felt like a door closing, like the end of something she hadn't wanted to end. "And you?" Thomas asked, turning to look at her. "What will you do when it's over?" "I'll stay here," she said simply. "This is my home. This has always been my home. I'll wait for Philippe in case he comes back. And if he doesn't, I'll still stay. This house, this village, it's all I know. It's where I belong." They were both silent then, the implications of their answers settling between them like a weight. They belonged to different worlds, different countries, different lives. The war had brought them together, but the end of the war would tear them apart. It was inevitable, unavoidable, as certain as the seasons changing. "Emily," Thomas said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him, really look at him. "I need to tell you something. I should have said it sooner. But I was afraid. I'm still afraid, but I can't let this end without saying it." Her heart was beating very fast now, though she tried to keep her face calm, neutral. "I love you," he said simply. "I know that's impossible. I know it doesn't change anything. I know it only makes things harder, but it's true, and you deserve to know it's true. You saved my life, yes, but you did more than that. You gave me back my humanity. You made me remember what it means to be more than just a survivor, to be a person who can feel and hope and care about someone beyond just myself. And I love you for that. I love you for your kindness and your strength and your stubborn determination to see good in a world that has given you so many reasons not to. I love you. And I needed you to know that, even if it changes nothing. Emily felt tears on her cheeks, though she hadn't realized she was crying. She had known on some level that he cared for her, but hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing him put into language what had been unspoken between them, was overwhelming. I love you too, she'd heard herself say, the words coming out in a rush, as if they had been waiting at the back of her throat all this time. I love you, and I don't know what to do about it, because you're right, it changes nothing. You'll leave, and I'll stay, and this will end, and we'll go back to being who we were before, except we won't really, because I'll always know that I loved you, and I let you go. Thomas reached for her hand, the same way she had reached for his on Christmas Eve, and she took it, holding on tight as if she could somehow keep him here through the strength of her grip alone. Maybe it doesn't have to end, he said quietly. Maybe when the war is over, when I'm free, I could come back. Or you could come to England. Or we could find some third place, somewhere that belongs to neither of us, and therefore could belong to both of us. Maybe loving each other doesn't have to mean losing each other. Maybe, Emily echoed, though she didn't quite believe it. The future seemed too uncertain, too fragile to support the weight of such hopes. But in that moment, with his hand in hers, and the fire crackling softly, and the spring air filtering through the cracks in the shutters, she let herself imagine it. She let herself picture a world where the war was over, and they were both free and they could simply choose to be together, without barriers or boundaries or the complications of nations and duty and all the things that kept people apart. It was a beautiful imagining, even if it might never be real. April came, and with it came rumors that grew louder each day. The Allies were pushing through France, liberating town after town. The German forces were in retreat, disorganized, desperate. It wouldn't be long now, people whispered. Maybe weeks, maybe even days. The village held its breath, caught between hope and fear. Liberation would be wonderful, but the transition might be dangerous. Retreating soldiers could be unpredictable, violent, and there would be scores to settle, old grievances to address, suspicions to air. Who had collaborated? Who had resisted? Who had simply tried to survive? The lines between these categories were not always clear, and the aftermath of war could be almost as dangerous as the war itself. Emily found herself thinking about Philippe more during these days. If he was alive, if he had survived wherever he had been taken, he might come home soon. The thought filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. Joy at the prospect of his survival, guilt about her feelings for Thomas, fear about how to reconcile the life she had lived in his absence with the life they might try to rebuild together. She had not been unfaithful to Philippe, not in the physical sense, but her heart had strayed, had found someone else to care for, and that felt like its own kind of betrayal, even though she had not chosen it, even though it had simply happened in the strange circumstances of war. Thomas sensed her inner turmoil, though they didn't speak of it directly. He could see it in the way she would sometimes sit at the window, staring out at nothing, lost in thoughts she didn't share. He understood, or thought he understood. She had a husband who might return, who had every right to return to a faithful wife and an unchanged home. Thomas's presence complicated that, made it impossible. They began, without quite discussing it, to prepare for the end. Not the end of the war, but the end of their time together. They spoke less of the future, more of the present. They tried to memorize each other, the sound of each other's voices, the way the firelight caught in Emily's dark hair, the exact shade of blue in Thomas's eyes. They were building memories to carry with them into whatever came next, when they would no longer have each other's physical presence to sustain them. And then, on a morning in late April, Gabriel came running to the house earlier than usual, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "They're coming," he said breathlessly. "The Americans. Someone saw them just a few kilometers away. They'll be here by afternoon, maybe sooner. The German soldiers at the camp, they're already packing up. Getting ready to flee. It's happening. It's really happening. Liberation." After years of occupation, after so much loss and suffering and fear, liberation was finally coming. Emily felt dizzy, lightheaded, as if she might faint. Thomas caught her arm, steadying her, and they looked at each other with a mixture of joy and sorrow, because liberation meant freedom, but it also meant ending. And endings are always bittersweet, even when they're necessary. The day unfolded in a blur of activity and waiting. The German soldiers did indeed pack up and leave, taking what they could carry and abandoning the rest. The prisoners at the camp were simply left there, guards gone, gates still locked but no one to keep them locked. By mid-morning, someone from the village had gone to the camp and opened the gates, and the prisoners had emerged, blinking in the sunlight, free for the first time in months or years. Emily and Thomas stayed inside, not yet ready to reveal his presence, not yet ready to explain. They watched from the upstairs window as the village began to transform, as people emerged from their houses cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. There was shouting, crying, laughter, the sounds of joy mixed with relief, mixed with disbelief. And then, in the afternoon, the Americans arrived. Jeeps and trucks rumbling down the narrow streets, soldiers with unfamiliar uniforms and easy smiles, chewing gum, and handing out chocolate to children who had almost forgotten what chocolate tasted like. The village erupted in celebration, people flooding into the streets, embracing soldiers, embracing each other, crying and laughing and singing. Thomas and Emily stood at the window, watching it all, and neither of them spoke, because there were no words adequate to this moment. Finally, as the sun began to set and the celebration showed no signs of abating, Thomas said, "I should go out there. I should find the American commander, identify myself, get processed, or whatever it is they do with recovered prisoners. The war isn't over everywhere, and I'm still technically a soldier. I have duties, responsibilities." Emily nodded, though she didn't trust herself to speak. This was it, then, the moment they had been building toward, the end they had both known was coming. Thomas turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Come with me," he said. "When I go out there, come with me. I want them to know. I want everyone to know what you did, how you saved me. You're a hero, Emily. You deserve to be recognized for that." She shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do, and besides..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Besides, she had a complicated life to return to, a husband who might still come home, a village that would have questions and judgments about the choices she had made. She needed time to figure out how to navigate all of that. "Then I'll go alone," Thomas said. "But Emily, I meant what I said before. This doesn't have to be the end. When things settle, when I know what's happening next for me, I'll find a way to get word to you. And if you want, if you're willing, we can figure out how to be together. Maybe not right away. Maybe not in any conventional way, but somehow. Because I can't imagine my life now without you in it." Emily pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him, holding him as tightly as she could. He held her back, and they stood like that for a long time. Two people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances and had somehow created something precious and good despite it all. "I love you," she whispered into his shoulder. "I love you," he replied. And then, because there was nothing left to say, because prolonging the goodbye would only make it harder, Thomas pulled away. He squeezed her hands one last time, looked at her as if trying to imprint her features onto his memory, and then he turned and walked down the stairs, out of her house, into the celebrating street, back into the world of soldiers and duty and whatever came next. Emily stood at the window and watched him go. She saw him make his way through the crowd, saw him approach an American officer, saw him begin to explain who he was. She saw the officer's face change from confusion to surprise to delight, saw him call over others, saw Thomas being surrounded by Allied soldiers who clapped him on the back and shook his hand and welcomed him back to the world of free men. And then the crowd shifted, and she lost sight of him, and he was gone. She stood at the window until long after dark, long after the celebration had died down and people had returned to their homes, exhausted from joy. She stood there until the street was empty and quiet again, until the only sound was the wind rustling through the new spring leaves on the trees. And then, finally, she moved away from the window. She lit a candle, sat down in her chair, and picked up her mending. The baker's wife had brought her another coat to repair just yesterday. There were seams that needed reinforcement, a hem that needed letting down. The work was waiting for her, as it always had, as it always would. She threaded her needle, made her first stitch, small and even, and nearly invisible. The familiar motion was soothing, grounding. Outside, the world had changed. The war was ending. Freedom was returning. But here, in her small house, in the quiet space she had occupied for so long, some things remained the same. She stitched and stitched and stitched, holding things together. The weeks that followed liberation were chaotic in ways that no one had quite anticipated. The joy of freedom was real, but it was complicated by practical problems that had to be addressed. There were shortages of everything: food, medicine, fuel. There were damaged buildings to repair, fields to replant, lives to rebuild. And there were questions to answer, justice to attempt, though what justice meant after so much injustice was a matter of considerable debate. Emily kept to herself during this time, continuing her work, going about her daily routines. She answered questions when asked. Yes, she had survived the occupation. No, she had not collaborated. Yes, she had managed to get by. People seemed satisfied with these answers, and she was grateful that no one pressed deeper, that no one asked about the months she had spent hiding a prisoner in her house. Gabriel came by sometimes, bringing news, checking on her in that way young people have of trying to be helpful without quite knowing how. He told her that Thomas had been taken to a larger town where the Allied command had set up a temporary headquarters for processing recovered prisoners. He told her that eventually Thomas would likely be sent back to England, though it might take weeks or even months given how many prisoners were being processed and how overwhelmed the military system was. She thanked Gabriel for the information and tried not to think about it too much. Thinking about Thomas, about where he was and what he was doing, and whether he was thinking about her, felt dangerous. It made her chest ache in a way that was physical, made her want to cry at inconvenient moments. Better to focus on the present, on the work in front of her, on simply getting through each day. Philippe did not return. May became June, and June became July, and still he did not return. Eventually, through channels that had been reopened after liberation, through Red Cross inquiries and military notifications, she received the answer she had been dreading and yet somehow already knew. Philippe had died 2 years earlier, in a forced labor camp in Germany. Pneumonia, the official notification said. He had been sick for a week before he died, had been buried in a mass grave with other prisoners who had succumbed to illness and overwork and despair. Emily received this news alone, sitting in her kitchen, holding the piece of paper that reduced her husband's death to a few bureaucratic sentences. She did not cry. She had cried so much over the years, had spent so many nights imagining exactly this outcome, that she had no tears left. Instead, she felt a strange sort of numbness, a hollow emptiness that was neither grief nor relief, but something in between. Philippe was gone. Had been gone for 2 years, which meant that for 2 of the 4 years she had waited for him, she had been waiting for someone who was already dead. The pointlessness of that waiting, the way she had held on to hope long after hope was justified, felt almost cruel in retrospect. But it also meant something else. Something she tried not to think about but couldn't help thinking about anyway. It meant she was free. Free from the guilt of having feelings for Thomas while her husband might still be alive. Free from the complicated questions of what she would have done if Philippe had returned, and she had to choose. The choice had been made for her, by forces far beyond her control, and she didn't know if that made things better or worse. She told Gabriel about Philippe's death when he next came by. The boy's eyes filled with sympathy, and he offered the condolences that people offer at such times, and she thanked him and sent him on his way because she couldn't bear to talk about it any more than that. She did not tell Thomas. She had no way to tell Thomas, wouldn't have known where to send a letter even if she had wanted to write one. And besides, what would she say? My husband is dead, so now we could be together without guilt. That felt wrong. Felt like it diminished Philippe's memory and cheapened what she and Thomas had shared. So she said nothing, and carried the knowledge of Philippe's death the way she carried everything else. Quietly, privately, one more weight added to the collection she bore. August arrived, bringing with it heat that made the stone houses trap warmth inside and made everything feel sluggish and slow. Emily's mending work had picked up somewhat. With liberation had come a certain amount of optimism, and people were beginning to think about the future again, about making things nice rather than just functional. She was grateful for the work, for the way it kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. She was sitting at her window one afternoon, working on a dress that someone wanted taken in, when she saw a figure walking down the street. At first, she paid no attention. People walked down this street all the time. It meant nothing. But something about this figure made her look twice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a particular kind of careful determination that she recognized, that made her heart suddenly begin to pound. She set down her sewing and stood up, her legs unsteady. She went to her door, opened it, stepped out into the street. And there he was, Thomas, wearing civilian clothes now, no longer a prisoner or a soldier, but just a man. He looked better than when she'd last seen him. He had gained some weight, his face was less gaunt, his eyes less haunted. But it was unmistakably him, and he was walking toward her house, toward her. They stood there in the street, perhaps 10 meters apart, looking at each other. Neither moved, as if both were afraid that this might be an illusion, that the other might disappear if approached too quickly. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I told you I would come back." "You did," Emily managed to say, her voice shaking. "I didn't. I wasn't sure if—" "I've been trying to get here for weeks," Thomas said, closing some of the distance between them. "They kept me at headquarters, debriefing me, processing paperwork, all the bureaucratic things that have to happen. And then they wanted to send me straight back to England, but I told them I needed to come here first. I had to come here first." "Why?" Emily asked, though she thought she knew the answer, hoped she knew the answer. "Because I love you," Thomas said simply. "Because you saved my life, and not just in the literal sense of hiding me from the guards. You saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be, someone who had given up on humanity. You showed me kindness when kindness seemed to have vanished from the world. And I can't leave France, can't go back to England without knowing if there's any possibility that we could have a future together." Emily felt tears on her cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. "Philippe is dead," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "He died 2 years ago. I found out last month. And I've been trying not to think about what that means, about you, about us, because it felt wrong to feel anything but grief. But Thomas, I love you too. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day since you left." The distance between them disappeared. Thomas crossed those remaining meters in a heartbeat, and then they were in each other's arms, holding on as if they could make up for all the weeks of separation in a single embrace. Emily buried her face against his shoulder and let herself cry, for Philippe, for the years of war, for the fear and loneliness, but also for the joy of this moment, for the miracle of this man who had come back to her when she had almost given up hope. "I can stay," Thomas said into her hair. "I mean, I'll have to go back to England eventually, handle some affairs, be officially discharged. But then I can come back here if you want me to. Or you could come to England with me. Or we could go somewhere else entirely, somewhere new where we can start fresh. I don't care where we are as long as we're together." Emily pulled back just enough to look at him, to see his face, to make sure this was real and not some dream her lonely heart had conjured. "You would stay here? In this small village? In France?" "I would stay anywhere you are," Thomas said. "Emily, I have nothing waiting for me in England. No family, no home, no job I particularly cared about. But here, with you, I have everything. You are my home now. You have been my home since that night you opened your door to me." "Then stay," Emily said, her voice steady now, certain. "Stay here. This house is big enough for two. This village could use another pair of hands to help with rebuilding. And She paused, smiling through her tears. I could use someone to help me eat all the vegetables Gabriel keeps bringing me from his mother's garden. Thomas laughed, and it was a sound of pure joy, the kind of laughter that had been absent from both their lives for far too long. I think I can manage that. They stood there in the street, holding each other, not caring who might see, not caring what anyone might think. The war was over. They had survived, and against all odds, against all logic, they had found each other and were choosing to build something new together. Eventually, they made their way inside, into the small house that had served as shelter during the darkest times. Emily put water on to boil for tea, a luxury that was becoming more available now. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, in the same spot where he had sat so many times before, but this time without fear, without the need to hide. They talked for hours, catching up on everything that had happened during their separation. Thomas told her about the processing center, about reconnecting with other RAF personnel, about the strange experience of being treated as a free man again after so long in captivity. He told her about the nightmares he still had sometimes, about the guilt he felt for surviving when so many others hadn't. Emily told him about Philippe, about the grief and the guilt, and the strange relief of finally knowing, of not having to wonder anymore. She told him about the village's slow recovery, about neighbors who were trying to rebuild their lives, about the small acts of kindness and the occasional flashes of cruelty that emerged in the aftermath of liberation. They talked about practical things too, where Thomas would live while they figured out their future, how they would explain their relationship to the village, when and how they might marry if that was what they wanted. These were complicated questions, but they faced them together, and that made them feel less daunting. As evening fell and Emily lit candles against the growing darkness, Thomas asked, "Do you remember Christmas Eve, when you made that small cake?" "Of course I remember," Emily said. "That was the moment I knew," Thomas said quietly. "That was the moment I understood that what I felt for you wasn't just gratitude or circumstantial affection. It was love. Because you took what little you had and used it to create something beautiful, not for yourself but for me. And I thought, this is what love looks like. This is what it means to care for someone, to want to bring them joy even when joy is the rarest commodity in the world." Emily reached across the table and took his hand, the same way they had held hands so many times before. But this time was different. This time, there was no fear of being discovered, no uncertainty about the future. This time, they were simply two people who loved each other, choosing to be together. "We should do something to celebrate," Emily said. "Not a party, I don't think either of us wants that, but something, some acknowledgement that this is a new beginning." "What did you have in mind?" Thomas asked. Emily thought for a moment, then smiled. "Let's go for a walk, together in the evening when the village is quiet. Let's walk through these streets that I've walked alone for so long, but this time with you beside me. Let's see what this village looks like when it's ours, not occupied or hidden or afraid." And so they did. As the sun set and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Thomas and Emily walked hand in hand through the streets of Saint-Colombe. They walked past the baker's shop, past the fountain in the square, past houses where families were sitting down to dinner. Some people saw them and waved. curious about the stranger with Emily, but not hostile, not suspicious. Others didn't notice at all, too absorbed in their own lives, their own recoveries. They walked to the edge of the village, where the road led out into the countryside, where hills rolled away toward the horizon. They stood there together, looking out at the landscape that was just beginning to heal from the scars of war, at fields that would be planted again, at forests that would grow back, at a world that was slowly, painfully, learning to be at peace again. "Do you think it will be difficult?" Emily asked. "Building a life together after everything?" "Probably," Thomas said honestly. "I imagine there will be hard days, times when the past catches up with us, when the memories are too heavy, times when we disagree or struggle or wonder if we made the right choice. But Emily, the alternative, living without you, going back to England alone, trying to pretend that these months never happened. That would be impossible. I would rather face difficulties with you than face ease without you." "I feel the same," Emily said. "And besides, we've already survived the hardest part. We survived the war. We survived hiding, fear, separation. Building a life together in peacetime should be easier than that." "Should be," Thomas agreed with a smile, "though I suspect it will have its own challenges." They stood there a while longer, watching the last light fade from the sky, watching the stars begin to emerge one by one. And then, as the air grew cooler and the night fully settled in, they turned back toward the village, toward the house that would now be theirs together, toward whatever future they would build. The years that followed were not without their challenges, as Thomas had predicted. There were raised eyebrows in the village about Emily taking up with an Englishman so soon after learning of Philippe's death. There were whispers, judgments, the kind of small-minded cruelty that exists in every community. But there was also acceptance, particularly from those who knew Emily well, who had seen her kindness throughout the war years, who believed she deserved happiness after so much loss. Thomas found work helping with reconstruction efforts. There was plenty of work to be done, buildings to repair, infrastructure to rebuild. His engineering background from the RAF proved useful, and he quickly became known as someone reliable, someone willing to work hard and learn new skills. The fact that he had been a prisoner, that he had suffered at the hands of the occupation, earned him a kind of respect that might not have been afforded to other foreigners. They married quietly in the autumn of that first year, in the small church where Emily had married Philippe almost a decade earlier. It was a simple ceremony, attended by a handful of friends, including Gabriel and his mother, who had become something of a second mother to both of them. There was no elaborate celebration, no feast. Such things were still beyond their means, and beyond the village's capacity. But there was joy, genuine and unforced, and that was enough. Emily continued her mending work, but as the village recovered and people had more money to spend, she was able to take on more interesting projects, making new clothes, not just repairing old ones. She discovered she had a talent for design, for taking simple fabrics and turning them into something beautiful. Thomas would watch her work, marveling at the precision of her stitches, the way she could transform material with nothing but needle and thread and vision. They had children eventually, 2 daughters who grew up hearing stories about the war, but who would never have to live through such times themselves, if luck held. The girls played in the streets where their mother had once hidden their father. blissfully unaware of the weight of history that surrounded them. And Emily and Thomas were grateful for that ignorance, for the privilege of raising children in peacetime, however imperfect that peace might be. Gabriel grew into a young man, taking over his mother's house-cleaning business and expanding it into a general household services company that employed several people from the village. He never married, but he remained close to Thomas and Emily, was like an uncle to their daughters. He never spoke to anyone else about the secret he had kept during the war, about the prisoner hidden in Emily's house. It remained between the three of them, a shared history that bound them together. As the decades passed, the war became history, became something people studied in schools rather than something they had lived through. The village changed, modernized, grew beyond its medieval boundaries. But Emily's house remained, that solid stone structure with its thick walls and its fireplace that had once hidden a fugitive. Thomas and Emily grew old in that house, watching their children grow up and have children of their own, watching the world transform around them while they remained rooted in this place that had brought them together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the fire was burning low and the house was still, they would sit together and remember. Remember the fear and the courage, the hunger and the small acts of defiance, the way love had found them in the darkest of times. They would hold hands, their fingers intertwined, and they would marvel at the strange path that had led them to each other, at the way a single choice, to open a door, to offer shelter, had changed everything. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked once, many years later, when they were both gray and worn by time but still unmistakably themselves. "Do you ever wish you had made a different choice that night?" Emily looked at him, at this man who had been a stranger, then a prisoner, then a shelter, then a love, then a husband, then a father, then a grandfather. She looked at the life they had built together from nothing, from the ashes of war and loss. "Never," she said. "Not once. Not ever." And it was true. Despite all the difficulties, despite all the challenges and judgments and struggles, she had never once regretted opening her door to him. Because in saving him, she had also saved herself. In offering him shelter, she had found her own shelter in return. Not just a physical place, but the kind of shelter that comes from being truly known and truly loved. From building something meaningful in a world that had tried so hard to destroy meaning. The prisoner had become her shelter, and she had become his. And together, they had created something that would outlast the war, outlast the fear, outlast even themselves. A story of kindness in a time of cruelty, of love in a time of hatred, of two people who chose each other when the world gave them every reason not to. As you lie here now, in your own safe place, in your own time of peace, let this story settle over you like a warm blanket. Let it remind you that even in the darkest times, humans can choose kindness. They can choose to see each other not as enemies or strangers, but as people deserving of compassion, of shelter, of love. Let yourself feel grateful for the peace you have, for the freedom to rest without fear, to sleep without worry. Not everyone has always had these things. Not everyone has them still. But tonight you do. And that is a gift, however ordinary it might seem. Take a deep breath in, hold it gently, release it slowly, letting go of any remaining tension in your body. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your mind drift toward sleep, toward that peaceful place where stories and dreams intertwine. Remember Emily and Thomas, two souls who found each other against all odds, who built a life together from rubble and hope. Remember that courage sometimes looks like opening a door, and love sometimes grows in the most unlikely places, and shelter can be both something we give and something we receive. Let yourself drift now, safe and warm, sheltered by the present moment, by the bed beneath you, by the knowledge that tomorrow will come and you will wake to face it. But for now, for this night, let yourself rest. The prisoner and the woman who saved him sleep peacefully in their story, their struggles behind them, their love enduring. And you too can sleep peacefully, carrying with you the gentle truth that kindness matters, that connection heals, that we are all, in the end, simply human beings trying to offer each other shelter from the storms. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep deeply. Let this story carry you into dreams of courage and compassion, of second chances and new beginnings, of love that survives even war. And if you found some comfort here tonight, if this story has helped guide you toward rest, I hope you'll join me again soon. Subscribe to Pillow Loom for more stories that soothe and settle, that ease you gently into sleep. Leave a like if this story touched you, and share it with someone else who might need a peaceful moment in their day. Until next time, may your dreams be gentle, your sleep be deep, and your heart be full. Good night.